Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff, where we are continuing our journey through some of the experiences of a famous Mormon from the past, Stewart Udall. Today we're looking at part 3, which will cover a letter that Mr. Udall wrote publicly, really calling the church to repentance on the issue of racism. So like we've done in the past, we're going to go ahead and read the article and then we'll take some calls. Just to recap, in part 1, we learned that Stewart Udall was a Jack Mormon, in that after he served a mission, after he served some time in the military, he distanced himself from the church. And when he raised his family, they weren't really a aggressive church-going family like Mormonism kind of demands of its membership. And he wrote a document articulating the reasons why he had to distance himself from the church. And you can see that many of those points are just as true today as they were back then. And among those points he listed was the fact that many Mormons were privately, what the word he used was negrophobes, or that they held racist sentiments in their heart, and that was given sanction by the church doctrine and teachings. Another point that he raised was that you really couldn't be just part Mormon. You couldn't go and then still speak your conscience if it was different from what the brethren wanted. You had to be 100% in or 100% out. And so he chose really to be on the outs, except for what was required by his more extended family that were deep in the church. In part 2, we learned that he became Secretary of the Interior under President JFK. And shortly after he took office, he started receiving letters and questions about his status as a Mormon, and whether or not, in the era where the nation was really coming out of a entrenched mental state of segregation, realizing that universal brotherhood was the way that society and humanity needed to go forward. And people were asking him questions, you're Mormon, aren't you, secretly racist, or aren't Mormons racist? And so he sent some of those letters to the first presidency of the church, asking them what can be done about the fact that the church is going to receive more scrutiny on that fact. And so part 3, we're going to see what happened after that. Now, before I do that, I realize there's something I need to do. And that is, I forgot to focus. I probably look better out of focus. All right, so here we go. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and bring this up. Okay, again, if you want to see and read along, or if you want to check out the article on yourself, you can go to thoughtsonThingsandStuff.com and search for the Stewart Udall sequence. If you click on the Stewart Udall sequence, you'll see the 6 different parts. There's part 1, part 2, and today we're going to go over part 3. And again, I'm going to start reading, and this is to capture the audio for a later video and podcast publication. And so there may be times that I have to stop and restart. Just bear with me on that point. Okay, starting. Stewart Udall, Sequence 3, The Letter. In part 1, we examined a statement of conscience that Jack Mormon Stewart Udall wrote for himself as he made the deliberate decision to distance himself from fellowship among the Mormon faithful. Among the reasons he listed was that many of the members were empowered to be lovers of their fellow men in public and negrophobes in private. Udall felt strongly about racial equality, working to end segregation alongside black activists. In part 2, we saw that after being appointed as one of the closest advisors to President John F. Kennedy, Udall was repeatedly confronted about his status as a Mormon and the racist teachings and policies of the church. He took it upon himself in 1961 to write a memo to the first presidency of the church expressing concern over the scrutiny and public criticism which the church would continue to attract over the policy. The reply that he received from the first presidency reinforced that the concepts of racial superiority, religious white supremacy, and anti-miscegenation were at the core of Mormon doctrine regarding black members. Like Lowry Nelson a decade before, Stewart Udall decided to write an open letter to promote change on a policy that he believed was wrong and hurt both the church and its members. As the highest-ranking national Mormon political figure, his appeal would attract a great deal of media attention, much of which would be embarrassing for the church. In this post, we will examine the contents of that letter and the supportive feedback he received. Interval events. In the years that followed his initial communication with the First Presidency in 1961, several important events occurred. George Romney had become the governor of Michigan, overcoming criticism for his status as a Mormon in view of his civil rights record, despite private chastisement by Apostle Delbert Stapley. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964 was passed, and the church had met with the NAACP and made a strong public statement in support of civil rights in one of its general conferences. You can see the blog post on Jeff Nye, Memo from a Mormon, for details about this NAACP meeting. Despite this, no new revelation on race was forthcoming, and the priesthood ban remained. In 1967, Udall determined that he could use his position to encourage a change. He decided to take his appeal to the public in the form of an open letter. Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, was a new independent LDS publication that had been launched in 1966. And he chose Dialogue as the venue for his letter. As the National Secretary of the Interior, his letter would have been given a prominent position in any secular publication, but it appears that Udall wanted the discussion to be one targeted to members of the church primarily. On the eve of the letter's publication, he sent a copy of it and a note to David O. McKay, the prophet of the church, stating, quote, "Dear President McKay, for many years, the question of the status of the Negro in our church has been, for me, and I suspect for many other Latter-day Saints as well, an agonizing issue. The hopeful events of the recent years, most notably the visible enlargement of human brotherhood and the spread of the ecumenical spirit among religions of the world, have served to heighten my own concern over this question. I have at last decided to speak out on this subject. The essay enclosed will appear in public print for the next... Starting again. The essay enclosed will appear in public print in the next few days as a letter to the editor in the next issue of Dialogue magazine. I want you to personally know that I have expressed myself with humility and utter honesty, and always with the prayerful thought that my action will, in the long run, help, not harm the church. Most sincerely, Stewart L. Udall, Secretary of the Interior." This is a letter from Stewart Udall to David O. McKay, 16 May 1967. You can go to archive.org and see a typed transcript of that letter that was sent to David O. McKay. Udall also forwarded copies of the letter to various friends, as well as George Romney, another prominent LDS politician, and both LDS apostles from his home state, Spencer W. Kimball and Delbert Stapley. Udall meant to be heard. The letter. On May 18th, the letter was published in the 1967 summer issue of Dialogue. You can find that issue at the Marriott Library Digital Archives here, as well as a more accessible format on archive.org. I encourage you to read the letter and form your own opinions. Let's examine the contents of the letter. Introduction. And here we'll begin a part where we read a portion of the letter and then comment on it periodically. For more than a decade, we Americans have been caught up in a revolution, in thinking about race and human relationships. The Supreme Court has wisely and effectively related the Constitution to the facts of life in the 20th century. 3 presidents and 5 Congresses have laid new foundations for a society of equal opportunity. Most of the churches, with unaccustomed and admirable militants, have enlisted foursquare in the fight for equal rights and higher human dignity. The whole future of the human race is now keyed to equality, to the ideal of equal opportunity and of equal civil rights and responsibilities. and to the new dignity and freedom which these would bring. The brotherhood of all men is a moral imperative that no religion and no church can evade or ignore. Enlightened men everywhere see now, as their greatest prophets and moral teachers saw long ago, that brotherhood is universal, and indivisible. Now, Udall begins by noting that in the wider world outside Mormonism, there have been significant changes in the attitudes and understandings about race and universal brotherhood. In the halls of government, this includes the Supreme Court, which had struck down the state-sponsored segregation of Jim Crow laws through numerous rulings such as Brown v. Board of Education, to past presidents and Congresses which enacted the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Furthermore, Udall points out that most churches had come to the elevated position of supporting racial equality. He correctly observes that this principle is one that no church can evade or ignore. This is particularly true because, as men everywhere are enlightened with this knowledge, any church that has not met the standard of universal brotherhood will stand apart like a misshapen creature cowering in the dark shadows of the past. The state of Mormon doctrine. Stewart goes on to address the contrast between society and the church on this issue. It was inevitable that national attention would be focused on what critics have called the anti-Negro doctrine of the LDS Church. As the Church becomes increasingly an object of national interest, this attention is certain to intensify for the divine curse concept, which so commonly held among our people runs counter to the great stream of modern religious and social thought. We Mormons cannot escape persistent, painful inquiries into the sources and grounds of this belief, nor can we exculpate ourselves from our church. Nor can we exculpate our. Okay, this is killing me. Nor can we exculpate ourselves from our church. Okay, I'm gonna take a swig of coffee. Hold up. Nor can we exculpate ourselves and our church from justified condemnation by the rationalization that we support the Constitution, believe that all men are brothers, and favor equal rights for all citizens. Now, Udall wastes little time in getting to the heart of the matter. He makes several bold statements here which call out those aspects of Mormon doctrine which are out of step with the ideals of universal brotherhood. By stating that the divine curse concept is counter to modern religious and social thought, Udall is warning that both the wider religious world and the secular world have surpassed the Mormon Church in moral standing on this issue. He observes that members are under greater scrutiny because of this disparity. Udall particularly calls out the church for hypocrisy. To this point, any time the church has been questioned about the racist policy, the church has pointed out that it fully supports civil rights legislation. To this point, any time the church has been questioned about its racist policies, the church has pointed out that it fully supports civil rights legislation and constitutional law, usually pointing inquirers to the 1963 General Conference Statement on Civil Rights. The church then separates the issue by stating that their policies of withholding priesthood from black men within the church are completely unrelated. Udall calls the church out on this double standard by stating that public condemnation of the church is justified and that this rationalization is illegitimate. These are strong words coming from a visible and highly placed Mormon in a very public forum. What is needed? Udall goes on to explain what is needed to remedy the situation. Reading again from the letter. This issue must be resolved, and resolved not by pious moralistic platitudes, but by clear and explicit pronouncements and decisions that come to grips with the imperious truths of the contemporary world. It must be resolved not because we desire to conform or because we want to atone for an affront to a whole race. It must be resolved because we are wrong, and it is past the time when we should have seen the right. A failure to act here is sure to demean our faith, damage the minds and morals of our youth, and undermine the integrity of our Christian ethic. So in prescribing what the resolution of this disparity should be, Udall shows that he understands the full depth of harm that such racist teachings can do. Doctrine has consequences. The ideas of a divine curse or skin color reflecting premortal unrighteousness, once planted in the minds of Mormons, gives rise to religiously sanctioned attitudes and behaviors towards others which are not worthy of the Christian injunction to love your neighbor. As such, a simple change of policy would be insufficient. Those teachings must be actively and explicitly named and disavowed because they are wrong. Step back and consider that a Jack Mormon in a highly visible political position is writing an open letter to the prophets and apostles declaring that what they are teaching about race is false and wrong. This is not a meek plea at the foot of authority. It is a shot across their bow. As we will see in a subsequent post, a lay Mormon making such statements publicly has consequences. It should not escape your notice that history has vindicated Udall. It took over 50 years, but in 2013 the church finally did disavow those false teachings in the Race and the Priesthood essay published on the church website. All are hurt. Udall next goes on to describe how all are damaged by toxic racist ideas. Reading again from the letter. In her book, Killers of the Dream, the late Lillian Smith, whose life was exposed to all the warping forces of a racist culture, wrote these words, quote, I began to understand, slowly at first, but more clearly as the years passed, that the warped, distorted frame we have put around every Negro child from birth is around every white child also. Each is on a different side of the frame, but each is pinioned there. And I knew that what cruelly shapes and cripples the personality of one is as cruelly shaping and crippling the personality of the other. End quote. My fear is that the very character of Mormonism is being distorted and crippled by adherence to a belief and practice that denies the oneness of mankind. We violate the rights and dignities of our Negro brothers, and for this we bear a measure of guilt. But surely we harm ourselves even more. End quote. Now, Lillian Smith was a white Southern author who boldly challenged the notions of racial superiority and segregation in her works of fiction and nonfiction. She spoke out on such issues before the civil rights movement, when it was considered acceptable. Starting again. She spoke out on such issues decades before the civil rights movement, when it was considered unacceptable to do so. This video will give you a brief glimpse into the profound impact of her work. The quote Udall selected was from her 1949 book, Killers of the Dream, a collection of memories and observations that became one of the most influential works leading up to the civil rights movements of the 1960s. There's a video that was inserted here that seems to no longer be there, so I'll have to fix that and insert it in the final product. Udall reflects that the same distorting effect which Smith describes from the racist South are also seen in Mormon culture. Remember, in his own statement of conscience, that he saw that many members were negrophobes in private. He was very familiar with the corrupting effects of false doctrine upon the hearts of his Mormon brothers and sisters. He unequivocally describes the Mormon doctrine and policy as a violation of the rights and dignity of our Negro brothers, and again calls out the false error of it by acknowledging that the church is guilty for it. Stewart Udall's letter is nothing short of a rebuke. A diverted past. Udall then points out that things weren't always this way, continuing again from his letter. Quote, what a sad irony it is that a once outcast people, tempered for nearly a century in the fires of persecution, are one of the last to remove a burden from the most persecuted people ever to live on this continent. The irony is deepened by the circumstance of history that the present practice of the church in denying full fellowship to the Negro grew out of troubles rooted in earlier pro-Negro policies and actions. It is well known that, starting again, it is well known that Joseph Smith held high ideals of universal brotherhood and had a strong pro-Negro leanings that were, in a true sense, prophetic. And it is well known that in the beginning, the church accepted Negroes into full fellowship until this practice offended its anti-Negro neighbors. It then settled for a compromise with its own ideals based on a borrowed superstition that the Negroes are under a divine curse. This anomaly is underscored by the fact that the church has always enjoyed excellent relations and complete fellowship with all other races. How different have been our associations with the American Indians, the Spanish-speaking peoples, the Japanese, and the Polynesians. What transformations might take place in our spiritual and moral energies if we were to become, once again, moral leaders in improving the lot of the Negroes, as we have striven to do with the natives of the South Seas. End of quote. So here Udall demonstrates that he is an astute scholar of Mormon history. He concisely describes the initial position of the church on race relations and the subsequent changes that were made after outside pressure was applied. For an excellent overview of the Mormon race doctrine, see Chapter 3 in Neither Black Nor White by Bush and Mouse, which can be found at Signature Books. And footnote 2, Udall doesn't mention that while it was Joseph who initially took a liberal stance regarding blacks, it was also Joseph which shifted towards religious segregation, divinely justified slavery, and white supremacy. And you can see the evidence of this in the blog post, Joseph Smith versus the Abolitionists. Continuing. By reclaiming that prophetic heritage, Udall argues, Mormons could stay true to their origins and once again take a moral lead in the world. A statement that Udall makes in this section would be the focus of many of the responses he received. He calls the concept of a divine curse a, quote, borrowed superstition, end quote. Now, it is true that the concept of the black skin being the result of a divine curse significantly predated the church. It was used by slavery apologists to give biblical sanction to the slave trade. And we have footnote 3 here, which says you can see a book review of Noah's Curse, the biblical justification of American slavery at BYU. If that were the end of the story, then Udall's statement that the idea was borrowed could be taken legitimately. However, the fact that Mormon scripture specifically endorses skin color relating to a divine curse, you can see the blog post Racism in the Book of Mormon, and perpetuates the ideas of the curse of Cain and Ham, see Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Moses, chapter 7, verse 22, and Abraham, chapter 1, verses 21 through 24. This leaves Udall's letter open to criticism that the divine curse was not borrowed, but a fundamental part of LDS canon. And as you will see in a subsequent post, those criticisms did come. A precedent for change. Udall next points out that the church has changed significant aspects in the past. Reading again from Udall's letter, quote, at an earlier impasse, the church, unable to escape the deeply embedded practice of plural marriage and thereby resolve a crisis of its own conscience and courageously, starting again, at an earlier impasse, the church, unable to escape history, wisely abandoned the deeply embedded practice of plural marriage and thereby resolved a crisis of its own conscience and courageously faced the moral judgment of the American people. In 1890, for most church leaders, polygamy was a precious principle, a practice that lay at the very heart of Mormonism. Its proscription took genuine courage, but our leaders were equal to the task. By comparison, the restriction now imposed on Negro fellowship is a social and institutional practice having no real sanction in essential Mormon thought. It is clearly contradictory to our most cherished spiritual and moral ideals. End quote. Now, people defending the priesthood ban frequently say that it would have been disastrous for the church to promote racial equality in its earlier years because society was not ready to accept it. What is usually not mentioned is that society was far less ready to accept polygamy than it was to accept racial equality. Udall makes the point here that the church was ultimately able to expunge polygamy from its core of practices, and that exercise was an important precedent. How much easier should it be to move towards greater brotherhood when there is far less doctrinal foundation for racism than there was for polygamy? The minds and hearts of the modern saints would be much more receptive to a move away from racism than the early saints were in the move towards polygamy. In each case, they had been prepared to follow the prophet, and so the change would be accepted. Final appeal. Stewart then ends his letter, reading again from his letter, quote, "Every Mormon knows that his church teaches that the day will come when the Negro will be given full fellowship. Surely that day has come. All around us, the Negro is proving his worth when accepted into the society of free men. All around us are the signs that he needs and must have a genuine brotherhood with Mormons, Catholics, Methodists, and Jews. Surely God is speaking to us now, telling us the time is here. The glory of God is intelligence, has long been a profound Mormon teaching. We must give it new meaning now, for the glory of intelligence is that the wise men and women of each generation dream new dreams and rise to forge broader bonds of human brotherhood. To what more noble accomplishment could we of this generation aspire? Stewart Udall, Washington, D.C." And that's the end of the letter. After making several bold confrontational statements, Udall ends with a reminder that the saints have always been told that the status of the band was temporary. He concludes by connecting this enlightened consciousness of universal brotherhood with the highest ideals of Mormon reverence, and asks a question that is certain to resonate in the hearts of his audience. Initial reaction. If Udall's goal was to prompt introspection and change in the hearts of lay and leadership of Mormonism, his letter was a bombshell and could scarcely be ignored. The press. The press in particular saw it for what it was and described it in no uncertain terms. The New York Times said, quote, "A demand that the Mormon Church immediately remove all restrictions on Negro members has been made by Stewart L. Udall, Secretary of the Interior." New York Times, 19 May 1967. The Lubbock Avalanche Journal, quote, "Interior Secretary Stewart L. Udall, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has challenged his church's doctrine of the divine curse of Negroes," end quote. That's the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, 19 May 1967. Another paper, quote, "A demand that his church resolve its Negro issues has been made by Stewart L. Udall, Secretary of the Interior, a lifelong Mormon," unquote. That's from the Southern Illinoisian, 23 May 1967. Another paper, quote, "Interior Secretary Stewart L. Udall, a member of the Mormon Church, has urged his faith to renounce its discrimination against Negroes because we are wrong," end quote. That's from the Nevada State Journal, 20 May 1967. Another paper, quote, "Stewart Udall, a Mormon, demands that the church clear up the Negro issue." That's the headline from San Bernardino County Sun, 25 May 1967. Another paper, quote, "Arizona's Stewart Udall gave his fellow Mormons and the ruling hierarchy of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints quite a jolt when he called upon them to open wide the doors of the church to the Negroes." Arizona Daily Star, 20 May 1967. Another paper, quote, "Behold, a new prophet has appeared in the person of Interior Secretary Stewart L. Udall, who wrote an unsolicited letter to Dialogue." That's from the California Intermountain News, which is a Mormon-specific paper, and you can hear a hint of the irony in that headline, 25 May 1967. All right. George Romney, Peter Priesthood versus Jack Mormon. Now, Udall was not the only prominent LDS politician in 1967. The other major Mormon political figure of the time was George Romney, who had been elected governor of Michigan in 1961 and was anticipated to be a front-runner Republican in a bid for the presidency. Romney's visibility is likely why Udall sent him an advance copy of the article prior to its publication. When questioned about his opinion on the Udall's letter, Romney drew a clear distinction between two camps in Mormondom, Peter Priesthood versus Jack Mormon. Quote, ostensibly, Secretary Udall's article in Dialogue and the letter to the President David O. McKay were written only as an expression of his viewpoint as a member of the church, Romney said in a statement issued by his office. Continuing in that quote, in light of the fact that church doctrine is not determined by the attitude and expression of the individual members or the leadership, he knows, as all other informed members of the faith, that his method of accomplishing the religious objective he seeks cannot serve any useful religious service. End quote. Romney has insisted that the Mormon doctrine should not be a factor in his political future because he did not draw it up, and under Mormon doctrine he has no role in trying to change it. This is from a newspaper article, the Sunday Herald, dated 21 May 1967. Now, Romney's position is one that is in line with the way that the Mormon priesthood authority was meant to work. The leaders determine the doctrine and make policy, and the members toe the line. Any change that occurs from the top down, not from the bottom up. This was reflected in a later published, This was reflected in a letter published by a Mormon in response to Romney's comments on Udall. Now, this is a letter to the editor written by another Mormon in response to Romney's comments, published in the San Francisco Chronicle, and the letter reads, in part, quote, when Romney said that Stewart Udall's public letter demanding membership equality for Negroes in the Mormon Church could serve no useful religious purpose, he was speaking as an Orthodox Mormon appalled at what he considered a flagrant violation of church rules by Udall. In the Mormon Church, guidance, believed to be inspired, always comes from the top. It never originates from the membership. Letter to the editor, Samuel W. Taylor, San Francisco Chronicle. Udall was a Jack Mormon. He wasn't afraid to stand by his conscience when he knew something was wrong, even if it went against the religious dogma of the church. He risked ostracism from his fellow Mormons in doing so. Romney's position was the epitome of Peter priesthood. You don't raise objections. You don't push for change. Obey is the first and only law. His fellow Mormons would respect him for it. The Romney paradox. The issue posed a more complex problem for Romney because at the same time he was criticizing Udall for taking a stand with the church, his wife was taking a stand with the Women's City Club of Detroit. Days before Udall's letter was published, Miss Lenore Romney was called upon, Miss Lenore Romney was called upon to quit the Women's Club of Detroit after a Detroit Free Press article reported that the club barred black women from membership as well as barring them from their dining room and lounge. While initially stating that, quote, I don't know of any policy like that, quote, she also declared that, quote, if there is such a policy, I would resign, end quote. Footnote 4 here. You can see article, Miss Romney urged to quit Women's Club in the Corpus Christi Caller-Times, 18 May 1967, for the source. It did not take long to confirm that the club, in fact, Sorry, we're having bandwidth issues. Starting again. A paper published at the time commented on the mixed positions. More bandwidth issues, sorry about that. Starting again. A paper published at the time commented on the mixed positions. Quote, yesterday, the governor's wife resigned from the women's... Starting again. Quote, yesterday, the governor's wife resigned from the Women's City Club of Detroit because of charges that it has a discrimination policy against Negroes. At the same time, Romney's own stand on civil rights became more clouded as he refused to endorse a demand by Stewart Udall, Secretary of the Interior, that the Mormon Church remove all restrictions against Negro members. That's from May 1967 at archive.org. Now, the paradox of resigning from a women's club which has racist policies, but then defending a church with racist policies, was likely not a comfortable position for Romney to be in. To his credit, he did not let the racist doctrines of the church dictate how he treated black individuals in his business or government policies. You can see George Romney and the Delbert Stapley letter for more about Romney on this issue. Positive feedback. A few people wrote to Udall, starting again. A few people wrote to Dialogue in support of Udall's appeal. Quote, "I hailed it as a welcome voice," wrote one leader. Still more individuals were so supportive of the appeal that Udall had published, starting again. Still more individuals were so supportive of the appeal that Udall had published that they took their time to write to him and congratulate him on his sentiments and bravery. He saved those letters, and they can be found in his archives at the University of Arizona. One reader from Salt Lake City wrote, "Your letter, or parts of it, to Dialogue came out in the Salt Lake Tribune this morning. Those of us, and there are many, who have been trying for years to make even a small dent in the church's armor of discrimination and intolerance against Negroes, rejoice that you've come out against bigotry and unchristian dogma. Speaking frankly, too many of our people show too much of the sheep-like quality of blind followership and are over-anxious to conform, passing the responsibility to the brethren for their spiritual and religious decisions." Positive letter 1 from the Stewart Udall and the Consequences of Conscience letter compilation found at archive.org. Now, Lowry Nelson, who had communicated with the First Presidency on the issue of the ban 20 years earlier, wrote, quote, "I'm proud of you. Would the little..." Starting again, quote, "I'm proud of you. Would that a little of your courage could get piped into the anemic headquarters." Letter from Lowry Nelson to Stewart Udall, 21 May 1967. Nelson also wrote a response letter to Dialogue, stating, quote, "Let nobody doubt that Stewart Udall has spoken for thousands upon thousands of his concerned and thoughtful fellow churchmen. The problem will not go away by being ignored. Decisions are urgently needed for no other reason than the moral one, to bring our principles of universal brotherhood into clearer view. There is, in my view, only one right and righteous answer." Lowry Nelson, letter to the editor, Dialogue, fall 1967. A brief note from a supportive acquaintance in California read, quote, "Congratulations on your encouragement of our Mormon leaders to come to grips with the inequality of Negroes in the church. You are dead right. Most of all, we harm ourselves by continuing to maintain a posture of superiority. Starting again, most of all, we harm ourselves by continuing to maintain a posture of superiority." Positive letter 3. Another reader from Utah wrote, quote, "I wish to congratulate you on your excellent and timely article dealing with the attitude of the Mormon Church on the Negro problem. I agree wholeheartedly with your statement that the time has arrived when the Church should re-examine its doctrine, so long accepted by the great majority of its members, the doctrine that the Negro is cursed with a black skin because of pre-existent sin on the part of the spirit which now inhabits his body. Not only must this doctrine be abandoned, but the entire concept of a connection between skin color and righteousness must be repudiated. To equate skin color with good and evil, as is done in the Book of Mormon, perverts all our thinking on the Negro problem." Positive letter 4. A sympathetic elder from California wrote, quote, "I've been reading in the newspapers about your article in Dialogue magazine on the Negro problem, and as a fellow Latter-day Saint, I just wanted to let you know that I agree with your views. It is true, as Governor Romney says, that the doctrine can only be changed through revelation, but this fact, to my mind, only points up the further fact that we need new revelation. However, we cannot expect to receive any word from the Lord on this subject until we as a people are ready and willing to receive it, for he will not force anything on us. So articles such as yours are of value and do some good. In any case, just wanted to let you know that you are not alone." Positive letter 7. A Utah attorney wrote to Udall, quote, This is to congratulate you and commend you for your clear, courageous statement in the current issue of Dialogue on the attitudes of our church on the Negro problem. Your statement has been long overdue, and we are hopeful that it will have some effect on the highest levels of church authority. However, we are not too sanguine that the revolution However, we are not too sanguine that the revelation ending this long-standing discrimination will result directly from what you have said. Positive letter 11. An official from the Ohio Department of Education wrote, quote, "Congratulations on your very forthright statement in Dialogue. It says so well what many of us believe so deeply. It is encouraging indeed to have such a statement from a person in high office and to have it put in such eloquent words. I hope it is read and understood at 47 East South Temple." Positive letter 15. Now these letters serve to show, starting again, these letters served to show Udall that he was not alone in his thinking. Society was emerging from the shadows of racism, and many church members were conflicted about how their own beloved church appeared to remain in the dark. Conclusion. Stewart Udall's letter in Dialogue in 1967 was an unabashed appeal for the ancient dogma of hate to be excised from the heart of Mormonism. He didn't cower before the robes of the men at the head of the church, but boldly called out those teachings which gave sanction to hate for what they were, wrong. The fact that it took the church over a decade after Udall's letter to change, starting again, the fact that it took the church over a decade after Udall's letter in order to change the racist policy is shameful. Adding to this embarrassment is the fact that it took another 46 years for the church to publicly disavow the idea of a divine curse in the 2013 Race and the Priesthood essay. The beauty of keeping your own conscience independent from the self-proclaimed moral authority of false teachers is that you, like Stewart Udall, are free to disavow hate and error in your own heart without waiting for those men blinded by their own power to give you permission. Next, the responses that Udall received were not all positive. In fact, there were far more responses from faithful Mormons who disagreed with his letter. The next post in this sequence looks at the content of those replies and what they reveal about the heart of Mormonism in the 1960s. And that's the end of the Stewart Udall sequence, part 3. All right. I apologize for my voice. I know it sounds thick and dark and moody, but that's because I'm recovering from something. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and open up the phone lines. If you guys have any response to what we just read, any insights or thoughts, then feel free to share. I am going to take a moment and set the call system up. So give me just a second. All right. Sorry about that. Now, starting again, coffee refill. Okay, let's take a look at some comments. Oak and Gray says, this letter was the final nail in the coffin for me on the topic of race. It proves to me that the Q15 are liars. Q15 just means the highest leader of the church. That's the 12 apostles and the 3 members of the first presidency. They know the reason for the racist past of Mormonism, and that is racism. Now, this points out an interesting thing that you'll notice if you read the Race and the Priesthood essay, and that is that the essay lays the blame of the racist thoughts and ideas that made its way into Mormonism's teaching and doctrine on prevalent racist notions that existed in America in the 1900s. And so as those members came into the church, those racist ideas came into the church and they found their way into the hearts and minds of the leadership. That's a little bit of weaselly language there. The church really needs to acknowledge that it wasn't just that members and low-level leaders were saying and doing and teaching these things. You have the people at the highest position of the church, the prophets and apostles themselves, articulating these things and not saying, it's the widely believed notion of the American people that the skin color is the curse. They don't attribute it to the racist teachings and ideas of the day. They attribute it to God as prophets themselves, who, as anytime a new prophet is called, just like President Nelson was recently, you have another apostle. I think the person that did it this time was Brother Anderson. If you look at Brother Anderson's talk when President Nelson was called, his whole talk is about gratitude that we have a new mouthpiece for God. And that concept of a mouthpiece for God, when you have the mouthpiece for God articulating racist teaching, thoughts, and ideas as the Word of God, that's something very different from if you were to go and listen to a Southern Baptist preacher, read the Bible, and then provide an interpretation or exegesis from his own mind about what the Bible means. It's very different from a man claiming to speak the will and mind of God. So that's a very poignant part. Oak and Gray goes on to say, to be honest, the church essays do nothing to address their wrongdoings. They are a Band-Aid, one that is too small and doesn't quite absorb that much. It's a very good point. One of the things that really calls to my mind how short-sighted and ineffective that essay is that the essay only addresses the teachings and the reasons around the priesthood ban. It doesn't address the elephant in the room, which is the priesthood ban itself was racist. At its core, the ban itself was racist. It's one thing to say that the reasons given were because of prevalent racist attitudes, but the church really needs to cross that threshold and say that the restriction on priesthood ordination itself, regardless of any reason at all, was inherently racist and the product of the racist notions of the day. And just let the consequence follow with that admission, because that is what needs to actually say. That way, because right now there was a study that was published a few years ago where some researchers had polled members of the church, both black and non-black members of the church, about the priesthood ban, and found that there were actually more black members of the church who believed that the ban itself was justified back in the day, even though it's not there now, and that defending the ban itself was less likely to happen among white members of the church. And it's this distortion of how we view issues that bear upon our own dignity that happen when you're in the church that tries to attribute all of the actions and doctrine and policy to God rather than admitting that they are the result of men. So, all right, so we have another comment here. Maxwell's Unearthly says, and this went on from Brigham to Kimball for 100+ years. Unbelievable. Where was God's love of revelation for all to partake of his blessings? Not in the Mormon church. I think one thing that is particularly interesting to look at on that point is there's something that I call the priority of revelations, which is when you think of all of the different things that God could issue a revelation on to somebody who actually was their prophet, the things that did come to the mind of Joseph Smith and early prophets before, the things that came before an explicit declaration of universal brotherhood could then be interpreted to be more important in the mind of God. And so the one revelation that really stands out to me as showing this contradiction is found in the Doctrine and Covenants. In Doctrine and Covenants section 111, if you go and read it, you'll see some weird story about Salem, Massachusetts and gold. And if you take some time to dig into church history and say, why was this revelation received? You find that some guy came to Joseph Smith and the brethren and said, hey, I know where some gold is in the cellar of this widow in Salem, Massachusetts, and she died, and nobody knows that the gold is there, so we can go and get it, the treasure. We can go get the treasure. And this is very much in keeping with the treasure hunting mentality that Joseph Smith had in his early days. So Joseph Smith and the brethren go to Salem, Massachusetts, and the guy meets them there, and he can't locate the house. Now, keep in mind, all of this is happening. When they can't they can't locate the house, because they went on the notion of revelation, Joseph Smith has to have another revelation to explain why they couldn't get it. And so in that revelation, which you can read in Doctrine and Covenants section 111, God says that all of the wealth in Salem, Massachusetts, and then it specifically says pertaining to gold, will be yours in the future. And there have been a number of later publications by defenders of the church trying to rationalize this as, that just means that later there will be wards and stakes built up in Massachusetts, but it specifically says pertaining to gold. It didn't say pertaining to membership and anything like that. But God was giving these revelations about finding non-existent golden treasure in dead widows' basements when God could have been preparing the prophet to prepare the people to accept universal brotherhood and reject slavery and reject all of the false ideas around race. And defenders of the church will say, oh, no, America was just universally racist. The people were just, even Christian churches, they were racist. If you watch the Three Mormons video on race and the priesthood, that's one of the points they make repeatedly, is that everybody in America was racist, and so we can't hold the church accountable. But the fact of the matter is, everybody was not racist. There's, the whole movement of the abolitionists occurred around the time, in the lifetime of Joseph Smith. One of the most vocal people in that movement was born just a few weeks before Joseph Smith was. And his name was William Lloyd Garrison, and he was a contemporary of Joseph Smith. He was Christian, and he felt that the Christian call on his heart and his life's work was to provide a rock-solid, firm, moral argument against slavery based on Christian principles. He started a newspaper to argue for this. And later, when slavery was made illegal at the end of the Civil War, Lincoln attributed the move of the nation as a mindset away from justifying slavery, to the extent that that could pass, to the work of William Lloyd Garrison and other abolitionists. And so there are Christian men and women of principle who see that this is wrong at the same time that Joseph Smith is condemning the arguments of the abolitionists, that Brigham Young later would, make the case against full fellowship and universal brotherhood for blacks on the same notions. And so the argument that everybody was racist just does not hold any water, particularly when you see that there are entire religious movements such as the Quakers or the Friends who argued vehemently against the biblical justifications for racism and slavery, and did so at the cost of their own standing in society. They were not afraid to pay that cost to stand up for truth against hate. And so anyone that defends Joseph Smith or the church on this point is basically saying that the church was not willing to pay the cost for standing up for truth and love against hate. And not only that, they're furthermore saying that the church was okay with paying the cost to stand up for polygamy and the havoc that it wreaked on the lives of everybody in the church and around in the community. All right. So, again, if you'd like to call, you can dial 210-422-2222. If we don't get any calls, we'll go ahead and wrap up shortly. We've got Mark Elwood saying, yes, Salem Treasure. Now, if you don't know Mark Elwood, he is a graphic artist who's working on a graphic novel that takes all of the different accounts from Joseph's early life around treasure digging and folk magic and is creating a graphic novel so that you can get a sense of what that experience looked like back in the day. And he's taking a really creative approach where, you know, if Joseph Smith or any of the people later testified that they saw demons or they saw spirits, then in the context of writing that, he's going to depict what it is that they said that they saw. And then it's just up for the reader to decide whether those accounts of seeing millions of demons on the hillside, things that we're just not familiar with, but when you dig into the old quotes and interviews and testimonials, that's what they said happened, then you get to see kind of what that looks like. So we're looking forward to what Mark is able to eventually publish. All right. Well, it looks like we don't have any calls, so I will go ahead and wrap this up. I did a little bit of audio editing on episode 1, and what I'll probably end up doing is cleaning up the audio, putting some overlays so that some of the references, you're looking at the source material, any of the quotes. Anytime a general authority is quoted, if there's video or audio available for that, then I'll go ahead and cut that segment in so you're actually hearing from, for example, Ezra Taft Benson or Spencer W. Kimball. And hopefully those will be published soon, but everything's kind of done based on my own availability and time, so there's no deadline. I just want to make sure that we've gotten the audio captured for each of these this February. All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap up. Last chance to call in, 210-422-2222. And with no calls, we'll see you next time on Talk on Things and Stuff.